show you how the background function in the camera works. I will also explain how you can use this feature to integrate 3D models into photos. Check out these examples from Pixabay. Let's start by creating a Redshift camera in Cinema 4D. We look through the camera and turn it on. Next, we open the background area. In the render settings, everything can be set as usual. This can be done either here or directly in the render view. I will change the settings directly on the camera. For this, I click on Override. This makes everything appear black. When rendering, we can then adjust the color using the color parameter. For example, if I select red, the background will be red. Now let's take a 3D object to render. I decide to use a simple sphere. Let's add a plane to this. I edit the sphere to make it look rounder by setting the segments to 60. I use the placement tool to place the sphere on the layer. I adjust the sphere a bit and also add a shadow. Now we add a light source. We use an infinite light source for our example. Then we align it so that a shadow is visible. I make the light a little brighter by moving the slider to the right. We only want to render the shadow of the ground, not the ground itself. To do this, I right-click on the surface. Then I go to Render tag and add a Redshift object tag. I click on Matte so that the surface is not rendered. With Override, I make sure that only the shadow of this surface is visible. So it looks like our object is floating in infinite space. This also works with other light sources. I replace the infinite light with the dome light. This works just as well. The dome light creates shadow that contours. I will make the area a little bigger now. Then I go back to the camera and set the background back to white. So we can render nice images with plain white background. But now I want to use one of the images shown as a background. I go to the camera and click on background. Under picture I can select the photo. I take the street photo and paste it here. I make sure the image is in the correct format. I use the frame option to fit the image to the render size. This can be done by stretching, cropping or direct fitting. But I see edges in the image at the moment. To correct this, I use the original resolution of the image. I can check the resolution in Windows Explorer, of course. Or I go to the Window menu in the program and open Render View. Since the image is already loaded, I can see the resolution here. I enter these values in the output settings so that everything fits when rendering. The values are 5714 per 3799. Now I close these windows. My current rendering is too big, so I will change that. I try 100% view, but that's too big, so I use 15%. That looks good now. There's a white border. I can remove it with stretch or crop. I noticed that the colors look different, probably because of color management. I disable color management to get the original image. So I go to color management in the render view settings. There is a W missing in the view menu. The resolution is probably too large. I select the unmapped option. Now the image looks exactly like the original one. Now let's look at some adjustment options. For example, I can move the image left or right with the offset. With the Y offset, I can move it up or down. I will undo that. With the gamma value, I can edit especially the middle area of the image. With the exposure, I can change the brightness of the image. This is all quite simple. All these settings directly affect the background image. With the hue setting, I can change the hues of the image. The saturation can also be adjusted, which is self-explanatory. Now we change the perspective a bit. It doesn't have to be perfect. It is important that the vanishing points and the horizon line are approximately correct. This looks good. Take a look at this. We could also change the focal length a little bit. Then we go back to the camera and then to the object. I think a focal length of 15 would be good. We can fine-tune that. As mentioned before, it doesn't have to be perfect. Let's zoom in closer to see the sphere better. It should look something like this. Now we switch back to the camera and background view. Under type, we can choose between 3 different modes. By default, it is set to in-render. This means that all settings for optics, color correction, and lens effects are also affect the background image. Let's look at an example. Going to optical. If I change the exposure, it also affects the background image. The same with the depth of field. I set the aperture small and focus on the sphere. The resulting blur also affects the background image. The same is true for color correction and tone mapping. If I activate these and make adjustments, you can see slight changes in the background image. Also, when I load lookup tables, the background image changes accordingly. These changes are minor, but they are there. For the background image, LUTs, I can add a lookup table. This also affects the background image. Turning this on. This affects the background image as well as the geometry and all the lens effects, but I don't need to show that in detail again right now. You can certainly imagine that. Let's get back to the background. There's a checkbox here called affected by bend rays. This means that the background image is also affected by refraction, such as glass materials. I have already prepared a glass material. Let's drag this onto the sphere. Now we can see the reflection of the background image in the sphere. The gray we see here is the ground, the matte surface. To make it more realistic, we could project the background image onto the surface so that it reflects off the top. However, that is not our focus right now. But as you can see, the background image is reflected in this sphere. If I uncheck the box, this reflection is removed and we look directly through the glass material. I activate it again and go to optical. Let's activate the depth of field again. Let's return to the background settings and uncheck the checkbox again. You will notice that the depth of field effect is also removed on the background image. Those are the 2 options we can affect here. I will turn the depth of field off again, go back to optical, and then back to the background. Now let's look at the post-composite mode. In render mode, the background image is taken into account from the beginning, so it affects all previous settings. If we switch to post-composite, the background image is added after the actual rendering process. This means that most settings no longer affect the background image. When I switch to post-composite mode, the affected by bend ray option no longer has any effect. This is also noticeable in the glass material as soon as I switch to post-composite. The refraction of the background image is no longer visible in the material. Instead, only a black area is displayed. To correct this, we click in the render tag at the top and navigate to the shadows section. There we activate the effects alpha option. Now everything works correctly again. Let's come back to the camera setting. In this mode, most settings no longer affect the background image. More precisely, most objects and settings have no influence. I now remove the glass material so that only the sphere is visible. I close the material editor and then go to optical. Here I select the exposure. If I change the slider here, only the brightness of the sphere changes. Now I go to the depth of field. With the eyedropper, I set the focus directly on the sphere. and I activate the bokeh effect. Currently the effect is very subtle. I will try a value of 0.01. As you can see, the background remains unchanged. I activate it again. Moving on to color correction, I select tone mapping. You can see that the sphere is affected, but the background is not. However, this does not currently apply to methods such as LUTs and color controls. These methods still affect the background image. To demonstrate this, I will go to the LUT menu and activate it. You can see that it is now affecting the background image. Likewise, if I'm under color controls and I increase the contrast there. Again, the background image is affected. Now we switch to the lens effects. Again, we see the same behavior, especially bloom, flare and streak only influence the geometry. And this works as expected. We return to the background menu. There is one more mode, pre-composite. When I activate this mode, no difference appears at first sight. In fact, it behaves very similarly to post-composite. That is, setting like optical or color correction have the same effect as before. However, there is one exception, color control and LUTs. These do not affect the background image, but the lens effects do. That is, if I go to the lens effects and select bloom and set a very small value, I really have to choose a very small value for the effect to be visible at all. If I go back to background and change the mode to post-composite, it becomes clear that the bloom effect only affects geometry. This illustrates the difference between post-composite and pre-composite. With pre-composite, we basically get the same result as with post-composite, but with the advantage that all lens effects affects both the image and the background. This brings us to the end of this movie. You have now been given a comprehensive overview of how to use the background tab in the camera to add a 3D object to a photo. You now know the differences between the various modes. In a future tutorial, I will show you in more depth how to insert a 3D model realistically into a photo. The goal here is to make the 3D object look as if it were actually in the photo. For now, your knowledge of the background tab in the camera should be sufficient. I hope this tutorial was informative and helpful for you.